I never thought I'd be the kind of mother who carried secrets about her own son. But here I am, 56 years old, sitting in my kitchen at 3 in the morning, staring at a cup of coffee that's gone cold while I wrestle with words I should have spoken years ago. My name is Catherine, and I've been a widow for 8 years now. When my husband passed, I promised myself I'd protect our son Michael from any more pain. He was 28 then, newly married to Sarah, and struggling to find his place in the world. I thought love meant shielding him from harsh truths. I thought being a good mother meant keeping quiet about the things that could hurt him. I was wrong. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning in October. Sarah's hands were shaking when she knocked on my door, her pregnant belly round beneath her coat. 6 months along, she was supposed to be glowing with that expectant mother radiance. Instead, her face was pale, her eyes red from crying. "Catherine," she whispered, clutching an envelope like it might disappear if she loosened her grip. "I found this in Michael's things. I don't understand what it means." I knew what it was before she even showed me. The return address was burned into my memory from all those years ago. The law office that had handled the settlement. The place where we'd agreed to never speak of what happened again. As I read the letter, my heart sank deeper with each word. It was a reminder about the sealed court records, a bureaucratic notice that should have been meaningless to anyone who didn't know the full story. But Sarah had seen it. Sarah had questions. And looking at her confused, frightened face, I realized that my silence hadn't protected anyone. It had only delayed the inevitable. "What settlement?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "What happened that I don't know about?" I could have lied again. I could have made up some story about a minor legal matter, dismissed her concerns with the authority that mothers-in-law sometimes wield. But sitting there, watching this young woman who was carrying my grandchild struggle with fear and confusion, I knew my days of protecting Michael from himself were over. If you enjoy emotional stories like this one, please subscribe to our channel. We're working toward 1,000 subscribers, and it really helps our work. And comment which city you're watching from. The truth was that 12 years ago, when Michael was 24 and working his first real job, he'd made a mistake. Not the kind of youthful error that becomes a funny story at family dinners, but the kind that leaves scars on innocent people. The kind that requires lawyers and confidential settlements and families agreeing to never speak publicly about what happened. A young woman named Jennifer had been his co-worker. She'd trusted him, maybe even cared about him, and Michael had taken advantage of that trust in ways that still make my stomach turn when I think about it. There had been accusations, investigations, meetings in sterile conference rooms where men in expensive suits decided how much money it would take to make the problem disappear. I'd sat through every meeting, watching my son's face as the details were discussed. Sometimes he looked remorseful, sometimes he looked angry, but mostly, he looked like someone who'd been caught doing something he'd always known was wrong, but had convinced himself he could get away with. The settlement was substantial, money that came from the college fund his father and I had been building since Michael was born, money we'd saved by working extra shifts and skipping vacations and driving used cars longer than we should have. Jennifer deserved that money and more for what she'd endured. But watching our life savings disappear to pay for our son's mistakes felt like a special kind of heartbreak. We'd made Michael promise it would never happen again. We'd insisted he get counseling, that he take responsibility for his actions, that he understand the magnitude of what he'd done. He'd agreed to everything. Seemed genuinely committed to becoming a better person, and for 12 years I'd believed he had. But now, sitting across from Sarah in my kitchen, I realized I'd never truly known whether Michael had changed or whether he'd simply gotten better at hiding his true nature. The son I'd raised, the man I'd defended and protected and made excuses for, might still be the same person who'd hurt Jennifer all those years ago. "Catherine?" Sarah's voice brought me back to the present. "Please tell me what this means. I need to know." Looking at her face, so young, so trusting, so completely unprepared for what I was about to tell her, I felt something crack open in my chest. For 12 years I'd carried this burden alone, convincing myself that silence was kindness, that some truths were too dangerous to speak aloud. But silence isn't always protection. Sometimes it's just another form of abandonment. I took a deep breath and began to tell Sarah about the woman her husband had hurt. about the money we'd paid, about the promises he'd made, and the questions I'd never stopped asking myself about whether he'd really changed. With each word, I watched Sarah's face transform from confusion to disbelief to a kind of quiet horror that reminded me of how I'd felt all those years ago, sitting in those sterile conference rooms while lawyers discussed my son's future, like he was a problem to be managed rather than a person who'd caused real harm. When I finished, the kitchen fell silent, except for the sound of Sarah's quiet crying and the tick of the clock that had marked time in this house for 23 years. Through celebrations and sorrows, through the raising of a child who'd become a man, I wasn't sure I really knew anymore. "Why didn't anyone tell me?" Sarah whispered finally. "Why didn't you tell me before I married him?" The question hung in the air like an accusation, and I had no good answer. Because I'd hoped it was behind us? Because I'd wanted to believe people could change? Because I'd been too much of a coward to risk my relationship with my son by telling his fiancée the truth about who he really was? All of those reasons felt inadequate now, sitting across from a pregnant woman who'd just learned that the father of her child might not be the man she thought she'd married. Sarah left my house that afternoon carrying more than just the weight of her pregnancy. She carried the truth I'd finally given her, and I watched through my window as she sat in her car for nearly 20 minutes, her hands gripping the steering wheel like it was the only thing keeping her anchored to reality. I knew she was going home to confront Michael. I knew my son would deny everything, or minimize it, or find some way to make it sound like ancient history that had nothing to do with the man he'd become. That's what he'd always done when uncomfortable truths surfaced. Turned them into someone else's problem, someone else's overreaction, someone else's misunderstanding. The phone call came 3 hours later. "How could you do this to me?" Michael's voice was cold in a way I'd never heard before, not even during his teenage years when we'd fought about curfews and responsibilities. This was different. This was the voice of someone who'd decided I was his enemy. "Michael, do you have any idea what you've done? Sarah is hysterical. She's talking about leaving me. She's pregnant with my child, and you've filled her head with lies about something that happened over a decade ago." "They're not lies, sweetheart. You know they're not lies." The silence stretched between us like a chasm. I could hear him breathing, could almost feel him searching for the right words to make this my fault instead of his. "That was handled," he said finally. "That was finished. That girl got her money, we all moved on, and it was never supposed to be discussed again. You violated that agreement. I violated an agreement to protect your wife. You destroyed my marriage to make yourself feel better about keeping secrets." The accusation hit me like a physical blow. Was that what I'd done? Had I told Sarah the truth out of genuine concern for her safety? Or had I simply grown tired of carrying a burden that was never meant to be mine alone? "Your father would be ashamed of you," Michael continued, and I felt something cold settle in my stomach. "He worked so hard to provide for this family, and you just threw away his legacy to hurt me. That wasn't fair, and he knew it." His father had been the one who'd insisted we pay the settlement, who'd spent sleepless nights wondering how we'd raised a son capable of hurting someone the way Michael had hurt Jennifer. But Michael had always been skilled at rewriting history to cast himself as the victim. "I didn't tell Sarah to hurt you," I said quietly. "I told her because she has a right to know who she's married to. She knows who she's married to. She's married to the man I've become, not the stupid kid I was 12 years ago. But now, thanks to you, she can't see past something that has nothing to do with our life together." Over the following weeks, the distance between us grew with calculated precision. Michael stopped returning my calls. When I texted, he responded with short, cold messages that made it clear I was being tolerated rather than welcomed. When I asked about Sarah, he told me she was dealing with unnecessary stress because of my interference. The first Sunday I wasn't invited to dinner felt like a test. Surely this was temporary anger that would fade once emotions cooled, and everyone could think rationally about the situation. Michael and Sarah had been coming to my house for Sunday dinner since their engagement. It was our tradition, our time to stay connected as a family. I cooked anyway, telling myself they might change their minds. I made Michael's favorite pot roast, set the table for 3, even put out the good china that had been my mother's. At 6 o'clock, I sat alone at that table, listening to the silence in my house and understanding that some bridges once burned, don't rebuild themselves. The exclusion became systematic after that. Sarah's baby shower was planned without me. I heard about it from my neighbor, whose daughter worked with one of Sarah's friends. They were having it at a lovely venue downtown, with a garden theme and professional photographs. 40 women were invited to celebrate the arrival of my grandchild. I wasn't one of them. When I called Michael to ask if there had been some mistake, his voice was carefully neutral. Sarah thought it would be best to keep the guest list to people who make her feel comfortable and supported right now. I'm her mother-in-law. I'm your mother. This is my grandchild. And you're also the person who caused her to question everything about her marriage during the most vulnerable time in her life. So no, Catherine, you're not invited. The way he said my name, Catherine, not Mom, felt like another small death. I'd become a stranger to the child I'd raised, the boy I'd protected and loved and sacrificed for. In his mind, I'd forfeited my right to be considered family the moment I'd chosen honesty over his comfort. I drove past the venue on the day of the shower. I didn't plan to. I was running errands and found myself on that street, moving slowly enough to see the women walking in with wrapped gifts and bright smiles. I recognized some of Michael's female cousins, Sarah's college friends, even my own sister Janet, who avoided my eyes when she spotted my car. Janet and I had always been close, but lately, our conversations had become stilted and uncomfortable. Michael had reached out to extended family members, sharing his version of events where I was the villain who'd deliberately sabotaged his marriage by bringing up old, irrelevant mistakes, just to cause drama. Maybe you could have handled it differently, Janet had suggested during our last phone call. Maybe you could have encouraged Sarah to focus on the present instead of the past. So you think I should have let her marry him without knowing? I think you should have trusted that Michael had learned from his mistakes and grown into a better person. And if he hadn't? If he hurt her the way he hurt Jennifer? Janet had no answer for that, but her silence told me everything I needed to know. In the family's collective judgment, I'd overstepped my bounds. I'd prioritized a stranger's decade-old pain over my own son's current happiness. I'd chosen to be divisive instead of supportive. The narrative they'd constructed painted me as a bitter widow who'd grown jealous of her son's happiness and had deliberately tried to destroy it. In their version of events, Michael was the wronged party, a man whose mother had betrayed him in the cruelest possible way, during what should have been one of the happiest times of his life. Christmas morning arrived with a silence that felt heavier than snow. For 34 years, Michael had been at my breakfast table on Christmas morning, opening presents and drinking the special coffee I only made on holidays. Even after he'd married Sarah, even after they'd moved into their own place, Christmas morning had always started at my house. This year, I sat alone with my coffee and the gifts I'd bought for them anyway, a baby monitor for the nursery, a soft yellow blanket I'd chosen because they weren't sharing the baby's gender, a silver picture frame that was supposed to hold the first photo of my grandchild. The gifts sat under my tree unopened, monuments to a relationship that had been severed as cleanly as a surgeon's cut. I'd been excised from Michael's life with the precision of someone removing something malignant, something that posed a threat to healthy tissue. By New Year's Eve, I'd started to understand that this wasn't temporary anger. This was permanent exile. I wasn't being punished for what I'd done. I was being eliminated because of what I represented. As long as I existed in Michael's life, I would be a reminder of the truth he wanted to forget. My presence would always carry the weight of what he'd done to Jennifer, of the money we'd paid, of the promises he'd made that he might or might not have kept. It was easier for him to rewrite the story completely, to cast me as the unreasonable outsider who'd tried to interfere with his happiness. It was simpler to build a new family narrative where he was the victim of my betrayal, rather than the perpetrator of someone else's trauma. The baby was born on a Tuesday in March. I know this not because anyone called me, but because I saw the birth announcement on Facebook 3 days later. A beautiful little girl named Emma Rose, 7 pounds, 2 ounces, born at 3:47 a.m. The photo showed Sarah holding her daughter with exhausted joy, Michael beaming beside them both, and my heart broke all over again, knowing I hadn't been there. I'd driven to the hospital twice during Sarah's labor, sitting in the parking lot like some kind of stalker, hoping someone might call and invite me up. I'd brought flowers, pink roses because they were Sarah's favorites, and a teddy bear I'd been saving since the day she told me she was pregnant. Both gifts sat in my passenger seat for hours while I wrestled with whether showing up uninvited would make things better or worse. In the end, I drove home without going inside. I couldn't bear the thought of being turned away at the maternity ward, of having security called because the grandmother was unwelcome. The humiliation would have been more than I could handle. 2 weeks later, I made my first real attempt to bridge the gap. I wrote what I thought was a beautiful letter. 3 pages of careful words about how sorry I was for the pain I'd caused, how much I wanted to be part of Emma's life, how families should forgive and move forward together. I poured my heart onto those pages, explaining that everything I'd done had come from love, even if it hadn't felt that way. The letter came back unopened, returned to sender, written in Michael's handwriting across the envelope. Not even the courtesy of reading what I'd written, my words, my apology, my desperate plea for reconciliation, all of it dismissed without consideration. I tried calling. Michael had blocked my number. I tried texting from a different phone. Those messages went unanswered too. I sent gifts for Emma through the mail, tiny dresses, soft toys, books I could read to her someday when this nightmare was over. Everything came back marked, refused. When Easter arrived, I did something I'd never imagined I'd have to do. I showed up uninvited to Michael's house, carrying a basket I'd prepared for Emma's first Easter. I'd spent hours selecting items: a stuffed bunny, board books about spring, a tiny yellow dress with matching bloomers. I'd even included a card for Sarah, hoping that motherhood might have softened her feelings toward me. Michael answered the door with Emma in his arms, and for a moment, my heart soared. Here was my granddaughter, finally, this perfect little person with his dark hair and what looked like her mother's eyes. She was wearing a pink dress I didn't recognize, her tiny hands waving at nothing in particular, completely unaware of the family drama that surrounded her existence. "What are you doing here?" Michael's voice was flat, emotionless. "I brought Easter gifts for Emma, and I wanted to see her. Just for a minute. You need to leave. Michael, please. She's my granddaughter. I know we have problems, but she doesn't deserve to lose her grandmother because of adult conflicts." Sarah appeared behind him, looking tired but beautiful in the way new mothers do when they're glowing with love for their babies. When she saw me, her expression hardened. "Catherine, you can't just show up here. I brought gifts for Emma, for Easter." "We don't want your gifts," Sarah said quietly. "We don't want you here." The words hit me like slaps. Not Michael's words this time, but Sarah's. The young woman I'd tried to protect, the one I'd told the truth to save from potential future harm, now looked at me like I was something dangerous that needed to be kept away from her child. "Sarah, I was trying to help you. Everything I told you because I care about you. You told me because you wanted to cause problems, because you couldn't stand seeing Michael happy." The accusation was so unfair, so completely opposite to my motivations, that I felt dizzy. How had my attempt to protect her been twisted into jealousy? How had honesty become malice in their version of events? That's not true. You know that's not true. What I know is that you waited until I was 6 months pregnant to drop a bomb on my marriage. What I know is that you could have told me before the wedding, or not at all, but you chose the worst possible time to share your concerns. She was right about the timing, and the guilt of that had been eating at me for months, but she was wrong about everything else. I hadn't told her to hurt Michael or destroy their marriage. I'd told her because she'd found the letter, because she'd asked direct questions, because lying to her face would have been another kind of betrayal. Can I at least hold her, just for a minute? Michael shifted Emma to his other arm, deliberately putting more distance between us. "No, please. I'm her grandmother." "You're the woman who tried to destroy her parents' marriage," Sarah said. "You're the woman who brought chaos into our lives when we were preparing for her arrival. Why would we trust you with our daughter?" The question hung in the air like a condemnation. In their minds, I'd proven myself untrustworthy, unstable, willing to cause pain for my own mysterious purposes. They saw me as a threat to their family's peace. Someone who might fill their daughter's head with uncomfortable truths about her father's past. I stood on their doorstep holding a basket of Easter gifts that would never be opened. looking at a granddaughter I wasn't allowed to touch, feeling like a stranger in the story of my own family. The little girl I'd waited 9 months to meet stared at me with curious eyes, having no idea that the woman desperate to hold her was supposed to love her unconditionally, was supposed to be one of the most important people in her world. "I love her," I whispered, not caring how pathetic I sounded. "I already love her so much." "Then prove it by staying away," Michael said, and closed the door. I stood there for several minutes, holding that basket and crying on their front porch like a woman who'd lost her mind. Neighbors walked by, some staring openly at the scene I was making. I'd become the crazy woman in the neighborhood, the estranged family member who showed up uninvited and caused scenes. The drive home was a blur of tears and traffic lights. I kept thinking about Emma's face, about how alert and beautiful she'd looked in Michael's arms, about how I might never get to read her bedtime stories or teach her to bake cookies or share any of the grandparent experiences I'd been dreaming about since Sarah's pregnancy announcement. That night, I did something I hadn't done since my husband's funeral. I got drunk. Really, truly drunk. Sitting in my kitchen with a bottle of wine I'd been saving for a special occasion that would apparently never come. I drank and cried and talked to my husband's photograph, asking him what I should have done differently, whether he would have told Sarah the truth or kept our son's secrets forever. The hangover the next morning was brutal, but it was nothing compared to the emotional weight I woke up carrying. Emma Rose Morrison was 3 weeks old, and I was already a stranger to her. In family photos, I would be the grandmother who wasn't there. In her baby book, there would be pictures with Michael's parents' friends, Sarah's family, everyone except the woman who'd given birth to her father and loved him unconditionally for 34 years. I'd become invisible in my own story, written out of the narrative like a character whose presence complicated the plot too much to be worth maintaining. The family I'd helped create, the traditions I'd established, the love I'd given freely for decades, all of it had been erased as if it had never existed at all. And the worst part was starting to understand that maybe, in their minds, my erasure was justified. Maybe I had caused irreparable damage by telling Sarah the truth. Maybe I had chosen the worst possible time to burden her with information about Michael's past. Maybe I was the villain in this story after all. 6 months passed like a slow drowning. Each day brought new evidence of how completely I'd been erased from the life I'd helped build. Social media became a torture device I couldn't stop using. Photos of Emma's first smile, her first time sitting up, her first taste of solid food. Milestones I should have witnessed firsthand, reduced to images on a screen that I studied like artifacts from a life I'd never lived. Michael posted pictures of 3 generations at family gatherings, Sarah's mother holding Emma, Sarah's grandmother cooing over her great-granddaughter, everyone beaming with the joy that comes from being surrounded by people who love you unconditionally. I wasn't even a ghost in these photos. I was simply absent, as if I'd never existed at all. The hardest part was watching Sarah's mother, Linda, step seamlessly into the role I'd been meant to fill. Linda got to babysit when Michael and Sarah went out for date nights. Linda got to buy Emma's first Christmas dress. Linda got to be called Grandma while I sat in my empty house, wondering if my granddaughter would ever even know my name. I started having conversations with myself that frightened me. Standing in grocery store aisles, I'd catch myself talking to Emma as if she were there, explaining why I chose certain vegetables, describing what I'd cook for her when she was old enough to eat real food. Other shoppers stared, and I realized I was becoming one of those women people whispered about, the ones who'd lost too much and couldn't quite find their way back to normal. My sister Janet's calls became less frequent, then stopped altogether. When I finally reached out to her, her voice was careful, measured, like she was talking to someone unstable. "Catherine, maybe it's time to consider that some bridges can't be rebuilt," she said gently. "Maybe it's time to focus on moving forward instead of trying to fix what's broken." "She's my granddaughter, Janet. How do I move forward from that? I don't know. But holding on to this pain isn't helping anyone, least of all you." After that conversation, I understood that even the people who loved me thought I should accept my exile gracefully. In their minds, I'd made my choice when I told Sarah the truth, and now I needed to live with the consequences without making everyone else uncomfortable with my grief. The isolation was complete by Emma's first birthday. I saw the party photos online. A beautiful celebration in Michael and Sarah's backyard, with pink balloons and a cake shaped like a butterfly. Emma wore a white dress with tiny pink flowers, her hair finally long enough for the smallest possible ponytail. She looked like a fairy tale princess, surrounded by people who adored her. I wasn't there. I wasn't even mentioned in the heartfelt posts Michael and Sarah wrote about their daughter's first year of life, about all the people who'd helped them through the challenges of new parenthood. I'd been completely written out of Emma's origin story. That night, I did something that scared me. I drove to their house and sat outside for 3 hours, watching the lights in Emma's nursery window. I wasn't planning anything harmful. I just wanted to feel connected to her somehow, even if it was only through proximity to the building where she slept. But sitting there in my car, crying, and staring at a house where I wasn't welcome, I realized I was becoming someone I didn't recognize. A woman who stalked her own family. A woman who couldn't let go. A woman whose love had become indistinguishable from obsession. When a police car pulled up behind me, I knew someone had called about the suspicious woman parked outside a family home. The officer was kind but firm. I needed to leave, and I couldn't come back. If I was seen in the neighborhood again, there would be consequences. "Is everything all right, ma'am?" he asked. And I almost laughed at the question. Nothing was all right. Everything I'd ever loved had been taken away because I'd tried to do the right thing at the wrong time. "I'm leaving," I told him. And for the first time, I meant it. The next morning, I packed away everything I'd bought for Emma. The clothes she'd never wear, the toys she'd never play with, the books I'd never read to her. I boxed up the baby gifts and stored them in my closet, next to my wedding dress and my husband's old suits. Artifacts from lives that no longer existed. I took down the photos of Michael from my mantle, the pictures that had documented his journey from infant to man, birthday parties, graduation ceremonies, his wedding day. All of it went into a box that I couldn't bring myself to throw away but couldn't bear to keep looking at. The house felt like a mausoleum after that, filled with spaces where love used to live, the guest room I'd prepared for Emma's visits, the high chair I'd bought and assembled with such hope, the rocking chair where I'd planned to hold her while she napped. My friends, the few I had left, stopped mentioning Michael and Sarah altogether. They'd learned that bringing up my family situation led to conversations that made everyone uncomfortable, tears that couldn't be easily soothed, pain that had no clear resolution. I became the woman they had lunch with but never asked about her personal life, the one they treated with careful kindness while avoiding topics that might trigger another breakdown. I was 57 years old, and I felt like my life was over. Not ending, but over. As if all the meaningful parts had already happened, and now I was just marking time until death released me from the aftermath of my choices. The depression was like living underwater. Everything felt muffled, distant, requiring more effort than I could manage. Getting dressed became a monumental task. Grocery shopping felt impossible. Some days I didn't leave the house at all, just sat in my kitchen drinking coffee and staring at the phone that never rang with news about my granddaughter. I started writing letters I never sent, to Emma, telling her about the grandmother she'd never know, to Michael, explaining why I'd made the choices I'd made, to Jennifer, the woman whose pain I'd finally acknowledged, even though it cost me everything. Pages and pages of words that no one would ever read. Conversations with people who either couldn't hear me or didn't want to. But somewhere in all that writing, something began to shift. The letters to Emma became stories about my childhood, about her grandfather, about the family history she was being denied. The letters to Michael became accounts of my own pain, my own sense of betrayal by a son who'd decided I was disposable. And the letters to Jennifer became apologies, not just for what Michael had done, but for the years I'd helped keep it secret. Winter arrived early that year, and with it came a clarity I hadn't expected. Sitting in my kitchen on a particularly gray afternoon, holding a cup of tea that had gone cold while I wrestled with thoughts I'd been avoiding, I finally understood something that changed everything. I still had something they'd forgotten about. Something they couldn't take away no matter how completely they erased me from their lives. Something that had been quietly growing stronger during all these months of isolation and pain. I had the truth. And the truth, I was beginning to realize, wasn't finished with any of us yet. For the first time in over a year, I felt something other than despair. It wasn't hope, exactly. Hope felt too fragile, too likely to be crushed again, but it was something, a small flame of purpose that had been smoldering under all the grief and self-doubt. I wasn't finished being Emma's grandmother, even if she didn't know I existed. I wasn't finished being Michael's mother, even if he'd decided he didn't need one. And I wasn't finished with the truth that had started this whole nightmare. It was time to stop grieving what I'd lost and start protecting what remained. The change didn't happen overnight. It began with small things. Organizing the letters I'd written into folders, researching laws about grandparent rights, quietly gathering information instead of drowning in emotion. For months, I'd been reacting to what had been done to me. Now, for the first time, I was thinking about what I could do. I started by calling the law office that had handled Michael's settlement all those years ago. The lawyer who'd represented us was retired, but his partner remembered the case. When I explained my situation, he was sympathetic, but clear about the limitations. Grandparent rights are difficult to establish when the parents are united in their opposition, he explained. The courts generally favor parental autonomy unless there's evidence of harm to the child. What about the original settlement? Doesn't that create any kind of legal obligation for disclosure? The settlement was sealed and satisfied 12 years ago. Unless there's evidence of new incidents or violations of the agreement's terms, it has no bearing on current family court matters. I hung up feeling defeated, but something nagged at me about his phrasing. Unless there's evidence of new incidents. What if there were new incidents? What if Michael hadn't changed as much as everyone believed? What if I'd been so focused on the past that I'd missed signs in the present? That night, I did something I hadn't done in over a year. I drove past Michael's office building during his lunch hour, not to confront him but to observe. I parked across the street and watched as he emerged with two colleagues, a man about his age and a young woman who couldn't have been more than 25. The way Michael looked at her made my stomach turn. It was the same hungry, possessive expression I'd seen years ago when he'd talked about Jennifer, back before we'd understood what that expression really meant. The young woman seemed uncomfortable, stepping away when he moved too close, glancing around as if looking for escape routes. I followed them to a restaurant, telling myself I was being paranoid, that I was seeing danger where none existed, because I was desperate to find reasons to justify my earlier actions. But as I watched Michael's behavior during lunch, the way he touched the young woman's arm despite her obvious discomfort, the way he positioned himself to block her exit from the booth, the way he leaned into her personal space, I knew my instincts were right. My son hadn't learned anything from what happened with Jennifer. He'd simply learned to be more careful about getting caught. Over the following weeks, I made it my business to learn everything I could about Michael's current workplace, his colleagues, his daily routines. Not to hurt him, but to protect whoever might be in danger from the man I'd raised. The young woman's name was Ashley Chen, a marketing coordinator who'd started at the company 6 months earlier. She was 24 years old, recently graduated from college, new to the city, and probably vulnerable in all the ways that predators recognized and exploited. I started showing up at the coffee shop near Michael's office, not to spy, but to be present, to be a witness. If something happened, if Ashley needed help, I wanted to be there. I told myself I was being a responsible citizen, but deep down, I knew I was also gathering ammunition for the war I was finally ready to fight. 3 weeks into my surveillance, I saw something that made my blood run cold. Michael and Ashley were having what appeared to be a heated conversation in the office parking garage. She was shaking her head, backing away from him, clearly distressed. He was following her, crowding her space, his body language aggressive in a way that transported me back to those terrible meetings with lawyers 12 years ago. I couldn't hear what they were saying, but I didn't need to. Ashley's fear was written across her face, and Michael's anger was unmistakable. When she finally broke away and ran to her car, he stood there watching her with an expression I'd seen before, frustrated entitlement, the look of someone who'd been denied something he believed he deserved. That night, I made a decision that would have terrified me a year earlier, but now felt like the most natural thing in the world. I was going to find Ashley Chen, and I was going to tell her everything I knew about Michael Morrison. Finding her contact information wasn't difficult. Social media made everyone accessible, and Ashley's profiles showed a young woman trying to build a career in a new city, posting photos of her small apartment and her rescue cat, sharing articles about workplace harassment and women's safety with the earnestness of someone who was still learning that the world could be dangerous. I crafted my message carefully, introducing myself as someone who had information she might need about a colleague, suggesting we meet for coffee to discuss something important. I didn't mention Michael by name or hint at the nature of my concerns. I just said I was worried about her safety and wanted to share information that might be relevant to her current situation. She agreed to meet, probably out of curiosity more than genuine concern. We arranged to meet at a cafe downtown, somewhere neutral where she could leave easily if she felt uncomfortable. I arrived early, choosing a table near the exit, wanting her to feel as safe as possible for what was likely to be a difficult conversation. Ashley was smaller than she'd appeared from a distance, delicate in the way that made my maternal instincts flare. She had Michael's young colleague had the eager, hopeful demeanor of someone who still believed that hard work and good intentions were enough to protect you from the people who might want to hurt you. "You said you had information about a colleague," she asked after we'd exchanged pleasantries and ordered coffee. "About Michael Morrison specifically. I know this is going to sound strange, but I'm his mother." Her face went pale, and I could see her calculating whether this was some kind of trap, whether I was there to defend him or threaten her on his behalf. "I'm not here to protect him," I said quickly. "I'm here to warn you. Has he made you uncomfortable? Crossed boundaries? Made advances you didn't welcome?" The relief that flooded her expression told me everything I needed to know before she said a word. "He's been persistent," she said carefully. "Inappropriate, I guess. But I didn't know if I was overreacting, or if it was just his personality, or if complaining would hurt my career. It's not your imagination, and it's not harmless. Ashley, Michael has done this before. 12 years ago, he sexually harassed a coworker named Jennifer. There was a lawsuit, a settlement, sealed records. The company made it go away quietly. She stared at me as if I'd just told her the earth was flat. His own mother is telling me this? His own mother is the one who paid for the settlement. His own mother watched him promise he'd changed, and his own mother has been watching him repeat the same patterns with you. I told her everything. About Jennifer, about the money we'd paid, about the promises Michael had made and apparently broken. I told her about Sarah, about how my attempt to protect one woman had cost me my relationship with my son and granddaughter. I told her about the months of watching her from a distance, seeing Michael's behavior escalate, knowing that history was about to repeat itself. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked finally. "What do you want from me?" "I want you to protect yourself. I want you to document everything he's done, report it to HR, file complaints if necessary. I want you to have the information I wish Jennifer had been given before he hurt her. But he's your son. He's my son, and I love him, but I can't stand by and watch him destroy another young woman's life. I can't live with knowing I had the power to prevent it and chose silence instead." Ashley left that cafe with my phone number, copies of documents I'd kept from the original settlement, and a clear understanding of who she was really dealing with. Whether she'd use the information was up to her, but at least she wouldn't face Michael's predation alone and uninformed. For the first time in 18 months, I drove home feeling like I'd done something meaningful. Not for my own benefit, not to ease my guilt or win back my family, but because it was the right thing to do. I was no longer just Michael's estranged mother or Emma's unknown grandmother. I was a woman who'd found her purpose in protecting others from the harm she'd failed to prevent before. This wasn't about forgiveness or reconciliation anymore. This was about justice. And justice, I was learning, sometimes required walking away from the people you loved most in order to love them properly. Ashley didn't contact me for 2 weeks after our coffee meeting, and I began to worry I'd overwhelmed her with information she wasn't ready to process. Young women in their first professional jobs often faced an impossible choice between protecting themselves and protecting their careers, especially when the threat came from someone with more power and influence in the workplace. Then my phone rang on a Tuesday evening. "Catherine, it's Ashley. I need to tell you what happened today." Her voice was shaky, and I could hear she'd been crying. I sat down in my kitchen, The same chair where I'd received so many devastating phone calls over the past 2 years, and prepared myself for whatever Michael had done. "He cornered me in the supply room today," she said. "He told me he'd heard I was spreading rumors about him, and that it would be very unfortunate if my contract wasn't renewed next month. Then he touched me, put his hand on my waist and said he hoped we could work things out privately." The familiar rage rose in my chest, the same fury I'd felt 12 years ago when I'd first learned what my son was capable of. But this time, the anger felt clean and purposeful instead of helpless and ashamed. Did anyone see it happen? No, that's why he chose the supply room. But Catherine, I recorded it. My heart stopped. You recorded it? On my phone. I've been keeping it in my pocket with the voice recorder running whenever I'm alone with him, ever since you told me about Jennifer. I have everything from today. His threats about my job, what he said about working things out. All of it. For the first time in 2 years, I felt something close to hope. Not hope for reconciliation with Michael, but hope that his pattern of behavior might finally be stopped before he could destroy another young woman's career and self-worth. What do you want to do with the recording? I want to take it to HR, but I'm scared. What if they don't believe me? What if they fire me for recording conversations without consent? What if this ruins my career before it even starts? I understood her fear completely. Jennifer had been afraid too, and her hesitation had given Michael time to craft his narrative, to position himself as the victim of a vindictive co-worker's false accusations. By the time she'd found the courage to report him, he'd already laid the groundwork for her dismissal. "Ashley, I can't tell you what to do, but I can tell you that if you don't report this, he'll keep escalating until he finds a way to force you into a position where you have no choice at all." She was quiet for a long moment. "Will you help me? I know it's a lot to ask, but I don't have anyone else who understands what he's really like." "Of course I'll help you." The next morning, I accompanied Ashley to her company's human resources department. I waited in the lobby while she met with the HR director, a woman named Patricia Wells who listened to the recording with the grim expression of someone who'd dealt with workplace harassment cases before and understood their complexity. When Ashley emerged from the meeting 2 hours later, she looked drained but relieved. "They're taking it seriously," she told me as we walked to our cars. "Patricia said they'll investigate immediately, and they're putting Michael on administrative leave pending the outcome. She also said I did the right thing by recording him, that it probably saved me months of he said she said disputes." "How do you feel?" "Terrified," Ashley admitted. "But also, free? Like, I don't have to spend every day looking over my shoulder anymore, wondering when he's going to try something worse." That afternoon, my phone rang with a call I'd been expecting but still dreaded. "What the hell did you do?" Michael's voice was pure venom. "What lies did you tell that girl about me?" I told her the truth. The same truth I told Sarah. "You destroyed my career. Do you understand that? I'm suspended from work because of your vindictive bullshit. You're suspended from work because you sexually harassed a colleague, just like you did to Jennifer 12 years ago." That was different. We had a relationship. It was consensual until she decided she wanted money. The casual cruelty of his dismissal, reducing Jennifer's trauma to greed, rewriting assault as consensual relationship, told me everything I needed to know about how little he'd actually changed. He still saw women as objects for his gratification, and any resistance to his advances as betrayal rather than basic human autonomy. "Ashley recorded you threatening her job if she didn't submit to your advances. There's no ambiguity this time, Michael. There's evidence. You turned my own mother against me. Do you realize how sick that is? What kind of woman betrays her own son to protect strangers? The kind of woman who raised a son who attacks women and then plays victim when he faces consequences." The silence that followed was long and heavy. When Michael spoke again, his voice had changed from anger to something colder, more calculating. "You'll never see Emma. You understand that, right? After this, you'll never be allowed near my daughter. Sarah already thinks you're unstable, and now she'll know you're dangerous. I've already accepted that I may never see Emma, but someday, when she's old enough to understand, she'll know she had a grandmother who chose to protect other women instead of protecting a predator. You chose strangers over your own family. I chose justice over complicity." I hung up the phone and sat in my kitchen, trembling from the confrontation, but feeling something I hadn't experienced in months: moral clarity. For 2 years, I'd been consumed by guilt over the choices I'd made, wondering if I'd been wrong to tell Sarah the truth, questioning whether I'd destroyed my family for reasons that weren't sufficient to justify the pain I'd caused. But talking to Michael, hearing him dismiss Jennifer's trauma and threaten Ashley's career, seeing him frame every woman's resistance as betrayal rather than self-protection, I knew I'd been right all along. Not just right to tell Sarah the truth, but right to help Ashley. Right to refuse to keep protecting a man who used that protection to harm others. The investigation moved quickly. Ashley's recording was damning, but even more significant was what it prompted other employees to report. 3 women came forward with their own stories of Michael's inappropriate behavior: touching without consent, sexual comments disguised as jokes, abuse of his position to pressure female colleagues into social situations that made them uncomfortable. Patricia Wells called me a week later to thank me for encouraging Ashley to report the harassment. "We found a pattern of behavior going back to when Mr. Morrison was first hired," she told me. Other women had reported incidents, but they were handled as isolated complaints rather than evidence of systematic harassment. "Your information about his history helped us understand that this was ongoing behavior, not a one-time mistake. What happens now? He's been terminated for cause. His behavior violated multiple company policies, and the recording provides clear evidence of quid pro quo harassment. He won't be eligible for rehire, and his personnel file will reflect the reasons for his dismissal." 2 weeks later, I received a letter that surprised me more than anything that had happened since this nightmare began. It was from Sarah, handwritten on cream-colored stationery that I recognized from the set I'd given her for her bridal shower. "Dear Catherine," it began, "I owe you an apology." She'd learned about Michael's termination through mutual friends, and the details had forced her to reconsider everything that had happened between us. She'd spoken to Ashley, who told her about our coffee meeting and my role in encouraging her to report Michael's harassment. "I understand now that when you told me about Michael's past, you weren't trying to hurt our marriage. You were trying to protect me from discovering his true nature in a much more painful way. I was too young and too in love to see what you were really offering me. Information I needed to make informed decisions about my future." The letter was 3 pages long, filled with acknowledgments of my good intentions, apologies for the cruel things she'd said, and explanations of how my information had finally started making sense in light of Michael's recent behavior. But the most important part came at the end. "I know I can't undo the pain we've caused you, and I know you have no reason to trust us again. But if you're willing, I would like Emma to know her grandmother. She deserves to understand where she comes from, and you deserve to be part of her life." I read the letter 5 times before I could fully process what it meant. After 2 years of exile, 2 years of believing I'd sacrificed my family for the sake of justice, Sarah was offering me a path back to my granddaughter. But something had changed in me during those 2 years of solitude and purpose. I wasn't the same desperate woman who'd begged to hold Emma on their doorstep, who'd stalked their neighborhood hoping for glimpses of the life I'd been denied. I was a woman who'd found her strength in protecting others, who'd learned that love sometimes required difficult choices that couldn't be undone or easily forgiven. The question now wasn't whether Sarah would let me back into their lives. The question was whether I was ready to rebuild relationships that had been poisoned by so much pain and misunderstanding, and whether forgiveness was possible when the fundamental damage had been done not by my revelations, but by the truth those revelations had exposed. I took 3 days to respond to Sarah's letter, 3 days of walking through my empty house, holding that cream-colored stationery, weighing the possibility of reconciliation against the reality of what we'd all been through. The woman who'd written me off as vindictive and unstable was now acknowledging that I'd been right all along. But acknowledgement didn't erase the months of exile, the missed milestones, the nights I'd cried myself to sleep wondering if I'd ever hold my granddaughter. When I finally called Sarah, her voice was tentative, careful in the way people speak when they're not sure if their apology has been accepted. "Thank you for the letter," I said. "It means more than you know." "I've been thinking about what you must have gone through," she replied. "Losing your son and your granddaughter because you tried to protect me. I can't imagine how painful that must have been." "It was necessary pain," I said, surprising myself with how true those words felt. I'd rather lose my family than watch my son destroy another woman's life. We talked for over an hour that first conversation, carefully navigating the wreckage of our relationship while trying to rebuild something that felt honest instead of just convenient. Sarah told me about the past 2 years from her perspective, how she'd struggled with doubt about her marriage, how Michael's behavior had become increasingly controlling and suspicious, how my warnings had planted seeds that finally bloomed when she learned about his firing. I started seeing things differently, she explained. The way he talked about his female colleagues, the way he dismissed my concerns about things, the way he always had explanations that made other people the villains in every story. I realized you weren't the problem. You were the only person brave enough to tell me the truth. What about Michael? How is he handling everything? Sarah's sigh carried 2 years of exhaustion. He's angry, furious with you, furious with Ashley, furious with his company for ruining his career over nothing. He hasn't taken responsibility for any of it. According to him, this is all a conspiracy of vindictive women who want to destroy successful men. The conversation that would change everything happened 2 weeks later. Sarah had invited me to lunch, our first face-to-face meeting since the day I'd told her about Michael's past. We met at a quiet restaurant downtown, and I was struck by how much she'd changed. The young woman who'd married my son had been replaced by someone older, wiser, marked by the kind of disillusionment that comes from discovering that the person you trusted most wasn't who you thought they were. We were halfway through our meal when Sarah's phone buzzed with a text message. As she read it, her face went pale. "It's from my friend Jessica. She works at the law firm handling Michael's employment termination." Sarah looked up at me with wide eyes. "Catherine, they found something else." "What kind of something else?" "During the investigation, they discovered Michael had been using company computers to search for things. Personal information about female employees, home addresses, social media profiles, photos. They found files on his work laptop with pictures he'd taken of women in the office without their knowledge." The restaurant seemed to spin around me. This wasn't just workplace harassment anymore. This was stalking, predatory behavior that went far beyond inappropriate comments and unwanted touching. "There's more," Sarah continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "They found evidence that he'd been doing this for years, not just at this company but at his previous jobs. They're turning everything over to the police." I set down my fork, no longer able to pretend to eat while processing the magnitude of what Sarah was telling me. My son, the baby I'd nursed and raised and loved unconditionally, had become someone who stalked women, who collected their personal information like trophies, who used his professional position to violate their privacy and safety. "Sarah, you need to take Emma and leave. Today." "I know." Her hands were shaking as she reached for her purse. "I've already packed bags for both of us. We're staying with my mother until I can figure out what comes next." "Does Michael know you're leaving?" "He'll know when he comes home to an empty house." That afternoon, I helped Sarah load the last of her and Emma's belongings into her car. It was the first time I'd seen my granddaughter in over 2 years, and she was beautiful, a toddler now, with bright, curious eyes and Michael's dark hair but Sarah's gentle temperament. She didn't know who I was, but she smiled when I handed her a stuffed animal I'd brought, accepting the gift with the easy trust that children show to adults who mean them no harm. "Say thank you to Catherine," Sarah prompted, and Emma repeated the words in the careful pronunciation of a child still learning language. Catherine. Not Grandma, not even Nana, just Catherine, like any other adult in her small world. But it was a start, and after 2 years of exile, hearing my name spoken by my granddaughter felt like a miracle. As Sarah buckled Emma into her car seat, she turned to me with tears in her eyes. "I'm sorry it took me so long to understand. I'm sorry I kept her from you when you were the only one trying to protect us. You were protecting your family the best way you knew how. There's nothing to apologize for. Will you stay in touch? I want Emma to know you. I want her to understand that she has a grandmother who loved her enough to risk everything to keep her safe." That evening, Michael called me. His voice was different than it had been during our previous conversations. Not angry anymore, but desperate, defeated. "Sarah took Emma," he said. "They're gone." "I know. Did you tell her to leave me?" "I told her to protect herself and her daughter. What she did with that advice was her choice. You destroyed my family. You destroyed my career. You destroyed my entire life. Michael, you destroyed your own life. I just refused to help you hide the wreckage. There was a long silence, and when he spoke again, his voice cracked with something that might have been genuine emotion for the first time in years. I need help, Mom. The word hit me like a physical blow. Mom, after 2 years of being Catherine, after months of being treated like an enemy, he was calling me Mom again. What kind of help? I don't know. Therapy, maybe. Treatment. Something. I can't keep doing this. I can't keep hurting people and then losing everything when they fight back. It was the closest thing to accountability I'd ever heard from him, and part of me wanted to leap at this opening, to offer him unconditional support and maternal comfort. But another part of me, the part that had been forged in 2 years of exile and painful self-discovery, remained cautious. Michael, I love you. I'll always love you. But I can't be part of covering up or minimizing what you've done anymore. If you want help, real help, then you need to start by taking full responsibility for the harm you've caused. Not just to Jennifer and Ashley, but to Sarah and Emma and me. I know. I think I know. And you need to understand that getting help doesn't erase the consequences of your actions. Sarah has every right to leave you. Those women had every right to report you. I had every right to warn them about who you really are. I understand. But as we continued talking, I realized that Michael's idea of taking responsibility was still fundamentally flawed. He was sorry for the consequences of his actions, sorry for losing his job and his family, sorry for being caught and exposed. But he wasn't truly sorry for the pain he'd caused, wasn't genuinely remorseful about the fear and trauma he'd inflicted on the women who'd trusted him. He wanted help because his life had become uncomfortable, not because he'd finally understood the magnitude of harm he'd caused others. He was calling me Mom because he needed something from me, not because he'd learned to value the relationship he'd discarded when it became inconvenient. When I hung up the phone that night, I understood that the man I'd raised was still asking me to prioritize his comfort over other people's safety. He was still asking me to be complicit in his harm, just in a different way. For the first time in my life, I was going to tell my son no. 6 months later, I sat in a courtroom watching my son plead guilty to multiple charges of stalking and harassment. The evidence against him was overwhelming. The recordings Ashley had made, the files found on his computer, testimony from 7 women who'd finally found the courage to speak about what he'd done to them over the years. Michael wore a suit I'd never seen before, probably borrowed from a lawyer or bought secondhand now that his corporate salary was gone. He looked smaller somehow, diminished by the weight of consequences he could no longer deflect or minimize. When the judge asked if he understood the charges against him, his "Yes, Your Honor" was barely audible. I'd debated whether to attend the hearing. Part of me felt I should be there to support him, the part that had spent 34 years believing that loving my son meant shielding him from the results of his choices. But a stronger part knew that my presence in that courtroom wasn't about Michael at all. It was about witnessing justice for Jennifer, for Ashley, for all the women whose voices had finally been heard. Sarah sat 2 rows behind me with Emma on her lap. My granddaughter was almost 3 now, old enough to sense the solemnity of the occasion, but too young to understand why everyone looked so serious. She colored quietly in a book while the judge outlined the terms of Michael's probation: mandatory counseling, community service, and most importantly, a restraining order that prohibited him from contacting any of his victims. When the proceedings ended, Michael turned to scan the courtroom. His eyes found mine first, then moved to Sarah and Emma. I saw him start to raise his hand in some kind of gesture, a wave maybe, or an attempt to get Emma's attention. But Sarah shifted her position to block his view of their daughter, and after a moment, he lowered his hand and followed his lawyer out of the courtroom. It was the last time I would see my son for over a year. The rebuilding of my relationship with Sarah and Emma happened slowly, carefully, like tending a garden that had been damaged by severe weather. We started with brief visits: coffee while Emma played in a nearby park, lunch at child-friendly restaurants where she could be distracted by toys and activities if the adult conversation became too heavy. Sarah was generous in ways I hadn't expected. sharing photos from the 2 years I'd missed, telling me about Emma's milestones and funny moments, gradually filling in the gaps in my granddaughter's story. But she was also honest about the challenges they faced. Emma sometimes asked about her daddy, and Sarah struggled with how much truth a toddler could handle about why he wasn't around anymore. I tell her that Daddy made some bad choices and needs to learn how to make better ones, Sarah explained during one of our visits. I don't want her to think he's a monster, but I also can't pretend he's just away on a business trip. Emma warmed to me gradually, the way children do with adults who show consistent kindness without demanding immediate affection in return. She started calling me Grandma Catherine, a compromise that acknowledged our relationship while recognizing that I was still essentially a new person in her world. The day she fell asleep in my lap while I read her a story was the day I finally felt like a grandmother, instead of just a woman who happened to be related to a beautiful child. Sarah found us like that. Emma curled against my chest, my hand stroking her soft hair while she breathed with the deep rhythm of peaceful sleep. She feels safe with you, Sarah said quietly. That's something she hasn't felt with many people since we left Michael. 3 months after the court hearing, I received an unexpected visitor. Ashley Chen stood on my doorstep, holding a bouquet of flowers, and wearing the confident expression of someone who'd survived something terrible and emerged stronger. I wanted to thank you, she said when I invited her inside, not just for warning me about Michael, but for showing me what it looks like when someone chooses to do the right thing, even when it costs them everything. Ashley had left Michael's company after his firing, not because she'd been forced out, but because she'd received a job offer from a competitor who'd been impressed by her courage in reporting the harassment. She was thriving in her new position, and more importantly, she'd become an advocate for other women facing similar situations. I volunteer with a support group for women dealing with workplace harassment, she told me. When they ask how I found the strength to report what happened, I tell them about you, about how you chose protecting strangers over protecting your own son. I wasn't protecting strangers, I said. I was protecting women who deserved the same consideration I'd want for my own daughter if I'd had one. That conversation helped me understand something important about the path I'd chosen. I hadn't just saved Ashley and the other women from Michael's future harassment. I'd helped create a model for how families could respond when someone they loved caused harm to others. Love didn't have to mean complicity. Protection didn't have to mean enabling. The letter from Jennifer arrived on a Tuesday in spring, almost 3 years after I'd first told Sarah the truth about Michael's past. I hadn't heard from her since the original settlement, and seeing her name on the return address transported me back to those terrible meetings where her pain had been reduced to dollar amounts and legal language. "Dear Mrs. Morrison," she wrote, "I hope this letter finds you well. I wanted you to know that I learned about Michael's recent legal troubles through mutual acquaintances, and I also learned about the role you played in helping his victims find their voices." She went on to explain how Michael's conviction had affected her, not with satisfaction or revenge, but with a sense of validation she'd been seeking for over a decade. For years, she'd wondered if she'd overreacted to his behavior, if she'd been too sensitive, if she'd destroyed an innocent man's reputation over misunderstandings and miscommunication. Knowing that other women experienced the same things I experienced, that his behavior was a pattern rather than an isolated incident, has helped me heal in ways I didn't expect, she wrote. But more than that, knowing that his own mother chose to believe his victims instead of making excuses for him has restored some of my faith in justice. The letter included a photograph, Jennifer at her wedding the previous year, radiant in white lace, surrounded by people who clearly adored her. She'd rebuilt her life, found love, created the kind of happiness that Michael had tried to steal from her all those years ago. "I wanted you to see that I'm okay," she wrote. "I wanted you to know that your courage in speaking the truth helped save other women from what I went through. And I wanted to thank you for being the kind of mother who loves her son enough to hold him accountable for his actions." On Emma's 4th birthday, Sarah asked if I wanted to help plan the party. It was a small celebration, just Sarah's family, a few of Emma's friends from preschool, and me. We decorated with purple streamers because purple was Emma's current favorite color, and I made the chocolate cake she'd specifically requested after tasting the one I'd brought to our last visit. Watching Emma blow out her candles surrounded by people who loved her unconditionally, I felt a contentment I'd never expected to experience again. This wasn't the family I'd originally planned for. Michael's absence was palpable, even at a 4-year-old's birthday party. But it was a family built on truth instead of secrets, on protection instead of enabling, on love that didn't require anyone to sacrifice their safety for someone else's comfort. Michael called that evening, as he did every few months since completing his court-mandated counseling. Our conversations were stilted, careful affairs where we talked around the enormity of what had happened between us. He was working as a night security guard now, living in a studio apartment across town, attending therapy sessions that he claimed were helping him understand the harm he'd caused. "I know Emma had her birthday today," he said. Is she happy?" "She's very happy. Sarah is raising her to be kind and confident and honest." "Does she ask about me?" "Sometimes. Sarah tells her age-appropriate truths about why you're not part of her daily life." There was a long pause before he spoke again. "Do you think, someday, when I've proven I've really changed, do you think there could be room for me in her life again?" It was the question I'd been dreading, because I knew my answer would hurt him, and because I wasn't entirely sure it was the right one. "Michael, Emma's safety and well-being have to come first. If there's ever a place for you in her life, it will be because you've demonstrated over years, not months, that you're no longer a threat to the women around you. And even then, it will be Sarah's decision to make, not mine. But you'll support that decision? Whatever she decides. I'll support whatever decision protects Emma and honors the truth about who you've been and who you might become." After I hung up, I sat in my kitchen, the same kitchen where I'd received that first devastating call about Michael's termination, where I'd cried over lost relationships and questioned every choice I'd made. But the woman sitting there now was different from the one who'd answered Sarah's desperate questions 3 years earlier. I'd learned that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is refuse to love quietly. Sometimes protecting your family means protecting them from each other. Sometimes being a good mother means accepting that your child might be someone you can't defend, and choosing justice over loyalty when the two come into conflict. I was 59 years old, and I'd finally learned the difference between love and enablement, between family loyalty and moral cowardice, between protecting someone from consequences and protecting others from harm. Most importantly, I'd learned that silence, the kind I'd maintained for 12 years about Michael's first offense, wasn't golden. It was just another form of abandonment, another way of choosing comfort over truth. Emma would grow up knowing she had a grandmother who'd chosen to speak difficult truths instead of comfortable lies. And someday, when she was old enough to understand the full story, she'd know that love sometimes requires the courage to walk away from the people who taught you what love meant in the first place. I finished my coffee and went to bed that night, without guilt, without regret, and without the weight of secrets I was no longer willing to carry. Some bridges burn completely, but that doesn't mean the crossing wasn't worth making.